Good evening, welcome to Novara Media's Fix. My name is Aaron Bastani, at Aaron Bastani on Twitter. I'm joined by fellow senior editor, one of the most remarkable people I've ever had the pleasure of coming to know, Ash Sarkar.
You couldn't remember my name for a minute. That was what that was.
Wow. It's a bit much. Ash?
I'm feeling very belligerent today, I'm sorry.
Good. Is that because you've just lost Kyle Walker, Tottenham, to Man City?
You said you weren't going to spring this on me on camera, right? Because I could have handled pretty much any other player, but to lose Kyle Walker, who's been such an integral part of the squad's development over, under Pochettino, and, he's just been... He means a lot to me. He also looks like my best friend, and I think that's why I'm so sad to lose him. And for any City fans who are out there watching, you don't deserve him. You won't love him the way I love him.
He's about to become the most expensive defender in world football, which I quite... I mean, you might like him, but he's clearly not that good. So, right.
Lead the way, Aaron.
I'll lead the way. We're going to talk, I guess, today quite substantially about race, which is a bit of a hot potato between Ash and I, because Ash is perhaps known for many of the longer-term Novara Media audience as someone who's very, very... I think one of the most valuable voices in the country, if I'm honest, about this stuff. If I say so myself. And you come historically from a slightly different angle to this stuff than I do, both intellectually, but also obviously your subject position. You're a brown woman, I'm a less brown man, so these are different subject positions, different experiences. And I suppose we were going to talk about a bit of that today, but you wanted to start particularly on recent goings on and abuse, racism.
Yeah. So I thought... experienced hostility and abuse online because people have accused me of being part of a party which kills people, which isn't abuse, that's just observation. So looking at how this discussion has become abstracted from discussions of power, right, of silencing and not just antagonism. Politics is antagonism. And also that, the absolute obliviousness of someone like Jess Phillips saying I too have suffered when she's made boasts of her disrespect for women such as Diane Abbott. So I guess that's where I wanted to start.
I mean, the Anna Soubry thing was literally a tweet and it said your party kills people, and she's like, I get abuse too. It's like, that's not abuse, that's an observation. That's a genuine observation. And you may disagree with it, you say, look, this is falsifiable, we don't, but it's an observation. And equally, you and I obviously both get some vitriol from the right. But again, we're going to feed back into this later on about subject positions and so on. You as a browner woman get a lot more of it than I do as a whiter man. So and I know that. That's blatantly obvious to me. And yet somehow Anna Soubry is drawing an equivalence between her experience and Diane Abbott's is it's remarkable. Because like you said, it's almost like a singularity. Left wing, woman, black, competent. oh my god, like, if you're Guido Fawkes or something on the far right, you're going haywire over this.
I mean, the Guido Fawkes stuff where, you know, it was the kind of really, it was sleazy. It was, you know, that's the only word I can think of. It was completely sleazy. And I think that speaks to the everyday debasement of black women's bodies in popular culture, because voices such as like Guido Fawkes, unfortunately,
Paul Staines in particular, right?
Right, you know,
that was his face photoshopped on in bed next to Diane Abbott.
I mean, it wasn't a, you know, it's not an outlier, unfortunately.
No.
I think it really speaks to voyeurism of violence and a kind of, you know, real horrible sense of, you know, spectatorship around black women's bodies. And I think that there's a spectrum that this exists on, from the kind of, you know, unhealthy kind of, you know, gaze aimed at like Black China in regards to like, you know, Rob Kardashian's like leaking of nudes and stuff like that, all the way to like Diane Abbott's. These things I think tell us something about the position of black women in culture. But I wanted to kind of talk.
Can I just quickly say one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Because Channel 4 shared this on Twitter, didn't they? It's a video of Diane Abbott talking about this stuff. It's 2 minutes long, and she expresses some of the things that she's frequently subject to, and people have said she's not fit to be the Shadow Home Secretary. She shouldn't have one of the great offices of state when Labour obviously win the next general election. This, to me, is the definition of a leader. Watch her read this stuff out. Do you think Theresa May could do that in a month of Sundays? Never. Even, and I like Jeremy Corbyn, the mental resilience and toughness she has to do that in the way she does, with the face she does, the physiology she does. She does not give a fuck, because she's in this game to change this country. And all power to her. What an amazing, remarkable woman. Diane, if you're watching, I think we both love you, right? Let's say this.
Auntie Diane. I ride for you, Auntie Diane. I ride for you. But also, and this is kind of the thing that I wanted to come on to, which is, so last summer, which is, you know, feels like an age ago now, I got really, really bad fascist harassment. I got filmed taking on this fucking Daenerys Targaryen fash woman at a migrant demo wearing this like hideous Union Jack hat. I got filmed and it got put out by neo-Nazi sites. And
what's her name again? Southern Lauren? Lauren Southern?
Something like that.
She's quite big. I mean, the alt-right's obviously big in North America, right? Yeah. She's quite big on Twitter.
Listen, with a bad bleach job, I could be huge on the alt-right too.
You had a really good line about her last time. Anyway.
I was just saying, those follicles are crying out for some conditioner. I digress. That experience really hammered home to me something which I kind of knew my whole life but like couldn't quite get a grip on, which is that the experience of racialized misogyny is, I think, uniquely isolating, and it is emotionally and mentally debilitating. I was not half as brave as Diane Abbott was, because when it was going on, I had offers from various news outlets to write about it, and I was like, I don't want to write about this, I don't want to speak about this, I just want to get on with my life head down. And then I watched the Diane Abbott video, and I was like, oh my god, what you are doing is carving open a space for not just women of colour, but in particular black women, and saying to them, this is what you will go through. It is violent, it is aggressive, it is exhausting, but the shame is not yours, it's theirs. And it's, you know, for as much as I don't think political gesture is in any way a substitute for kind of, you know, the much more intimate social network, stuff like that makes a huge difference in terms of participation. Huge.
I think the word leadership in electoral politics is massively overused, right? He's a leader, she's a leader, this is leadership, prime ministerial. This, in the context of electoral politics, for me, is leadership. Because like you say, it's creating a space, both in action and in rhetoric, for people both within electoral politics, but also just in everyday life and practice, to comprehend prejudice and racism around them and to act accordingly and understand it's not just them. They are not alone. They are fighting a battle, and they're sharing that with sisters and brothers, not just in this country, around the world. It's very important.
Speaking of comprehending bigotry and prejudice, let's move on to Anne Marie Morris and her comments at the East India Club. So for those of you who don't know, Anne Marie Morris is a
racist?
I mean, I was going to say... Oh my God.
She's a racist. Okay.
I mean, she used that phrase "N-word in the woodpile" when referring to Brexit
Sorry, say it a bit slower, more slowly, because people might not be acquainted with it.
N-word in the woodpile, which I think she was using like skeleton in the closet or elephant in the room, whilst doing a kind of private talk at the East India Club about Brexit. And then she was like, well, it's a slip of the tongue, it's a commonly used phrase. And I was like, I'm not the only person who's never heard this phrase before.
I ain't heard of that.
But what's the history of it?
It's from the American Confederacy. Surprise, surprise. N in the woodpile was about the underground. What's it called? The
Underground Railroad.
Yeah, the Underground Railroad. Sorry. And it was about slaves who became former slaves and their exit to the Union, the North, out of the Confederacy. And there was a cartoon. If you just sort of Google this, N in the woodpile, there's a sort of cartoon from around the time of the American Civil War. And basically, one of the primary ways of how they'd get out of the Confederacy would be to be hidden amongst wood on like a horse and cart as firewood. That would be one of the ways out. And there's a cartoon which shows Abraham Lincoln on top of a wood pile, and then there's somebody hiding in the wood. So it's a brazenly racist term. It's not even British in its origins. I mean, people make mistakes with words all the time, but I mean. This is not that.
I mean, the thing is that, like,
this is not that.
This is really, but when she was like, it was a slip of the tongue, I was like, that word is not on everyone's tongue.
No.
But even if...
maybe at East India Club, right?
I mean, that's what I was
thinking. Which is the thing about the ruling class, yeah.
Right, I was like, this is like old school racist bingo. I can't believe like the kind of infrastructure around the story that they're at the East India Club, they're talking about Brexit, and a Tory MP uses this word, this phrase, and I gave it some thought, and I was like, actually, this is entirely coherent with I'm not just talking about Brexit as an ideological position, but thinking about it as a kind of set of dispositions of a kind of cultural amalgamation. It's entirely in keeping with how the Conservatives have been flexing for time. So thinking about Liam Fox, right, talking about at the Scottish Conservatives conference, and he says Britain is the only European country that does not need to bury its 20th century history. Like, for real, are we talking about the same 20th centuries here? Absolutely not. Boris Johnson, right, in his summer conference speech, he talks about up the like inlets and gullies around the world go the gunboats of soft power. It's this real colonial nostalgia. Isn't even a word that will cover it. It's like a weird like pith helmet hard on. It's horrendous.
I mean, it's not nostalgia in so much as it's still. I mean, they still think it exists. I mean, that was a description of present day British soft power, right? So it's not even nostalgia. It's I don't know what the hell it is. I mean, it's a very living metaphor in the minds of these people. To an extent, they think it still describes a sort of empirical reality.
So, because we've talked a lot about the relationship of the Conservatives to xeno-racist state apparatus, and we've talked a lot about that on this show. But to what extent would you agree with the fact that the Conservatives are institutionally racist, right, to their very core? They don't just sort of incubate a racist culture vis-a-vis this kind of colonial nostalgia. What do you make of that?
Are they institutionally racist? I mean, inarguably, right? I mean, this is obviously the extreme wing of that. But then Ken Clarke, who you had the displeasure of appearing alongside, and was that a BBC Radio 4 programme recently?
It was Any Questions.
Any Questions. Is that Radio 4 or Radio 2?
Radio 4, baby.
Radio 4. Radio 4. 9 million listeners, I think, right? Any questions sometimes? I don't know. Radio 4's
9
big.
million listeners, and I still can't get my crush to text me back.
Yeah, Radio 4's big. BBC Radio is big, right? And he's one of the woke Tories. And even, well, you can tell your account. I don't need to ventriloquise.
Oh, I mean, I think, like, coming back to this question of, like, are the Tories institutionally racist? In the Green Room, Ken Clarke was kind of talking very dismissively about the media coverage of Grenfell. And he was, I mean, the level of, like, disingenuousness was really, really got my goat, because he was saying, like, oh, we're ghoulish, like, why are we jumping to blame people? Why is there all this footage of people kind of blaming, MPs and politicians, is outrageous, and then kind of gets up on any questions and is like, oh, thoughts and prayers, such a tragedy. And I was like, that's ridiculous. But institutionally racist, to what extent are the Conservatives institutionally racist?
He's the most progressive Tory right now in the Parliament, like Conservative Party, and I think he's racist. So that tells you something. And also, obviously the Conservative Party is inimically attached to the British state and its major institutions. Ideologically, it's still very much attached to the British Empire, but even the more modern strain of conservatism, I think, exhibits English nationalism. So this whole sort of reaching for the UKIP vote, they said, well, look, 52% of Brexit, vote to leave the EU. If we get that same vote in a general election, we'll have a majority of 150. That was their prediction effectively around this general election. And ultimately, they viewed a coalition of big business, older voters who have assets, and English nationalists. They believed that coalition would give them that majority. So, yes, they're institutionally racist on every level, both in terms of established ruling class interests, but also in terms of a sort of more petty-minded English nationalist working class sentiment, which, by the way, I think they overestimated.
I mean, I would obviously agree with you that the Conservatives are institutionally racist, and you only have to look at some of their history in this regard. So I'm not just talking about Enoch Powell, I'm also talking about if you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour.
Right, which was very recent, that general election.
Yeah, it was the 1960s. I'm also thinking about
64,
some of the policies that they were at the helm of, including so-called virginity testing of South Asian migrants at Heathrow Airport, which went on right up until the 1980s.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking about some of the more contemporary responses, like after the London riots, which have been forms of, I call it like a faceless racism, right? So it's a kind of, racist bureaucracy involving the dispersal of, in particular working class communities of colour, and then you think about the kind of managed decline of working class communities of colour. I would say all these things are institutionally racist. The reason why I raise it like this, and we're talking about a relationship to a particular idea of Britain, Britishness, and identity, does that mean that the Labour Party are also institutionally racist?
Great question. What do you think?
I want to hear you answer it first.
The Labour Party, excuse me, conveniently timed. The Labour Party, historically, and we can only obviously go on history, has been clearly attached to the major institutions of the British state. It's never been Republican, for instance. Originally, it wasn't opposed to the Empire. Even in 1945, after Clement Attlee enacted a very progressive domestic agenda, still clung on to the idea of empire, still kept very high, elevated military spending, primarily to safeguard Britain's overseas assets, protectorates, colonies. So no, and also it was a co-founding state of NATO. So I don't see how on any level you could say that the Labour Party historically has been an anti-racist party. That's not to say the contemporary Labour Party, which I think again will be the next government, couldn't enact policies which clearly advantage people of colour, both in Britain and beyond it. But yes, its history is pretty clear. And in addition to that, I would say that almost counterintuitively, one of the most powerful anti-racist strains within the modern Labour Party is Blairism, which was a fanatical adherence to globalisation, open borders, free movement of people, capital, goods and services. Clearly attendant with that was an authoritarian regime, Charles Wood, Iraq. No, I was thinking more about domestic stuff. So you had they've all been folded now, soccer, all these counter-terrorist and sort of organised crime, sort of kickbacks, heavily racialised. If you ever go into a court and you see the kinds of things they deal with. Yes, Iraq foreign policy under Blair. Nonetheless, that adherence to globalisation meant that Britain, for instance, when Central and Eastern European countries, which is now a major issue, right, in the context of Brexit, when they joined the EU, Britain was one of a select group of countries, I think including Ireland and Sweden, which basically said straight away, freedom of movement, right to work, please come here. And where did that come from? That came from, it's a good thing, it should have happened, I'm not criticising it, but it came from an ideological adherence, like I say, to a particular variant of globalisation and a particular understanding of free markets, where actually free movement of workers is advantageous not just to them but also to business. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened, but counterintuitively, Blair was actually quite progressive in that respect. And it's something he wanted to defend, and furthermore, the death of Blairism can be denoted by the fact that Chuck Schumer wants the end of freedom movement. Because that variant of globalisation, and he's still a Blairite, by the way, died in 2007 with the global financial crisis. And so there's a shift there as well. And I don't think that's static.
Disagree with you. Because I think this is where we have to kind of unpick what we mean by racism a bit. And we have to think about what's the difference between cosmopolitanism and anti-racism.
Very good.
And
liberal cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, liberal cosmopolitanism.
Very good. Yeah.
Not the fun kind with magazines and cocktails. I didn't do international relations. I'm still learning about these terms. The reason why I say this is because, Blair's migration policy was not about improving conditions for people of colour.
No.
It was about creating a racialised, precarious working class. So you saw, and I talked about this last week, a reduction in successfully granted asylum applications, an increase, almost totally, in the opposite way, proportionately, of temporary working visas. Yeah. We're talking about Eastern European countries. While we would say that their whiteness is contingent on more things than those of people of colour, for non-EU migrants, conditions were and still are immiserated. What we have seen is not a trickle down of the rights afforded to white or EU migrants to non-EU. What we've seen is a trickle up of the conditions of precarity. I think we also have to look at things like the McPherson report. Yeah. So the McPherson report, of course, uses this incredibly important phrase, institutional racism, to describe the police cover-up and the kind of complicity and perjury of the Metropolitan Police in the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Now, that's only in place for 2 years before David Blunkett says, well, the slogan has missed the point. So I don't think we can look at... anti-racism is not the right word to describe Blair. And you even look at the use of institutional...
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. Yeah.
But you also look at the use of institutional racism within the McPherson report. And it is a significant defanging of the way in which that phrase was used in the 1980s in the black radical tradition in the UK. Because the meaning shifted from how do institutions reproduce racism, right? To institutions which contain within them a racist culture, right? And that was the slippage that occurred within the McPherson reports. And so what I want to look at is, and this is kind of coming back to a question which we throw around a lot, which is, wither anarchism in the age of Corbyn, is that for me, when I talk about the institutional racism of the Labour Party, does that mean I'm going to stop supporting them publicly? No. Does it mean that I don't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister? Well, he already is, so that's beyond the point.
Do you know the last general election? Right, he's the Prime Minister.
I've still not sobered up since the Eggnett polls. Obviously not, but for me, that anti-statist relation is looking at the limitations of state projects or statist projects in terms of racial emancipation. Right, the state apparatus is itself racialized, so I don't think that we can ever contain.
I'll quickly respond to that,
yep.
And then we'll go to a break.
Yes.
Right. So what I would say is Blairism, I think to some extent was a progressive move forward, but that wasn't because of an ideologically held belief. It wasn't born of anti-racism, and there was actually a very powerful anti-racism movement in this country, late 80s, early 90s. But because there was an upturn in the global economy, which afforded a certain kind of attitude towards low-pay immigrant labour. And the two were coterminous with one another. And of course, Gordon Brown, after he became Prime Minister in 2007, a year or two later, he famously said British jobs for British workers. And many centrists were going, oh my God, we thought those days were over. Well, no, this politics will now inevitably return because of the global financial crisis, an economic downturn. And that politics of race was masked, frankly, for 10 years because of an economic reality which would never sustain, right? Global upturn. You can have people coming in. Living standards felt like they were improving. Why? Because actually we were getting cheaper and cheaper goods from the global south. You could repress pay, but inflation was very low because of those goods and services, particularly from China. And that went. And so fundamentally the big questions on race and capital and immigration in the 1990s and 2000s really were never answered. They were only avoided, and I think that was made possible by an economic moment which is now finished.
I also think it's an ideological moment which we'll come to after our little break.
So,
are we ready?
Back in a sec.
Over the last 10 years, things have really changed.
us.
But for all of the darkness, every cause has an effect.
40 students on the roof of Millbank.
Tienen mucha experiencia.
For all the talk of change, the present moment is really one of crisis.
A crisis of democratic representation.
Of identity.
A climate crisis.
Of a failing economic model which isn't working for most people.
We can't have a media that's beholden to advertisers or the political ambitions of oligarchs.
Which is why, in 2013, we founded Novara Media.
Unlike corporate media, we are funded by our subscribers.
There's no tax avoiders, there's no oil money, and there's no lords. What we're creating is media for you, which quite simply, you make possible.
We're looking to raise £40,000. That will allow us to not only keep on paying our contributors, but give them a little bit more, as well as keep our studio and take our fantastic Novara events nationwide.
To help us get there, go to support.novaramedia.com and give a one-off donation, or even better, sign up for a subscription.
We've already achieved so much, but the truth is, we've barely started.
Legend. What?
Sorry.
Welcome back. We've been talking race, power, capital.
Hold on to your melanin because there is a lot more to come.
You wanted to frame the rest of the show with a very simple question, didn't you, Ash?
Aaron Bastani.
Yeah.
Dr. Bastano. Are you brown?
Wow. That's tough.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. It's really tough. I mean, we've talked about this lots of time. I mean, people are very, oh, Novara, all white guy. I mean, well, frankly, I mean, if somebody has a pair of eyes, they can see that's not the case with you, with me. But
I do have a white alter ego. Her name's Ashley, and she can get out of any situation.
But it's a common thing with, I mean, I'm half Iranian, and everybody knows that you put an Iranian out of the sun for like longer than 6 months, they go whiter than an Eskimo, or Inuit as they're called, sorry. So there goes naughty language there. But yeah, so Iranians fundamentally don't look often very different to a Northern European even. So are they brown? And it's a similar question for Armenians, who are racialized by most Europeans or North Americans as Christians, as therefore being white. So it's one of those difficult areas to respond to.
I hate to break it to you, but it was a trick question.
Go on, what's the answer?
So the reason why it's a trick question is because I'm always...
We'd rehearsed this, by the way.
It's because I'm always interested in how people answer this question. Because it seems to me to be indicative of the kind of state that anti-racist discourse has found itself in, which is we are always reproducing the tendencies and the narratives of white supremacy. So we try to locate race in phenotype. We try and locate it in relation to whiteness and how we look or feel in relation to whiteness. Or we trans-historicize things, right? So we talk about Armenians abstracted
and we just did all three, I think, right?
Abstracted from issues of power, of conquest, etc., etc.
Genocide.
And genocide, of course. And so the reason why I asked this question in such a way is because it's not about Aaron, are you brown? It's not about Ash, are you brown? I mean, duh. The question is, to what extent can we ever escape a white supremacist logic, which is that race is fundamentally a question of identity, rather than, I think, a anti-racist or indeed a race abolitionist logic, which admits that is about power.
Let me be devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Imagine I'm an alt-right YouTuber, but not outright racist, just sort of whataboutery alt-right YouTuber. And I said, but hold on. The Japanese, they had an empire. They colonized bits of Manchuria. So racialized conquest and ideas of racial hierarchy aren't unique to Europe. Ash, so there. And what would your answer be?
To which my answer would be, well, duh. You can't. We're not just talking about any empire. We're talking about a particular historical context and particular economic relations that emerged out of it. So we're looking at coloniality and capital together, right? Because, you know, Rome was an empire. It also had a black emperor, right? Septimus Severus, who I think was he from Carthage? I think he was from Carthage.
I think so.
So we're not just talking about any empire, we're talking about particular technologies of governance, how and why they came to be. There's a great FM on this, The Invention of Whiteness, with my best bud, Kerem Nishanjolu. I really recommend you listen to it.
Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, Macedonian Empire, his first wife, obviously his, the heir to the throne was Persian, I believe, or Afghan.
Right, so we're looking at a specific historical context.
Yeah.
Kerem sums it up very well, and he talks about the displacement of Genoese capital from the Mediterranean and, the need for European expansion, westwards, right, into the American colonies, and the, this being powered by the transatlantic slave trade and the, racial taxonomies which emerged from that as well. And the reason why I'm framing it like this is because I guess I wanted to show that we are all complicit in reproducing these essentialist taxonomies. And I think that it's something which, despite what I've been calling the phenonaissance, the kind of renaissance of decolonial thinking, particularly the work of Frantz Fanon, though curiously not other thinkers from the negritude movement. We don't really talk about Senghor or Césaire that much. And also...
why is that?
I think
Is that because Fanon's such a great writer, stylistically, or...?
I think it's because Fanon is the more accessible text, certainly. I think it's because he the scope of his writing, that journey from the Caribbean to Europe to Algeria is, it's kind of, while lots of people kind of did that journey, I think only he wrote about it in that, precise kind of way. Also, his background as a psychiatrist, I think, really, really significant. And also because, unlike Senghor, he never then became a part of a powerful political class, right? Like he died before he even got to see Algerian independence. So maybe we never got to see the flaws of his thinking in the same way.
Kind of like a Jim Morrison of
Who?
his generation. The Doors, Jim Morrison, died like 20 hours. Or Jimi Hendrix, better example, right?
Okay, I was going to be like, who's Jim Morrison?
You kidding me? You never, Val Kilmer, The Doors. You never seen that film?
No.
Are you kidding me? Anyway, basically read Frantz Fanon. Don't watch The Doors of Val Kilmer.
But also this moment where there's a real popularisation of Afro-pessimist thinking. So I'm thinking about the works of Fred Moten and Frank Wilderson, the third in particular. So those to me seem to be the kind of real poles of radical anti-racist thinking at the moment. Where do you think the state of the discourse is in anti-racist thinking?
I don't know. I mean, it's not something that I've been, because of, like you say, those inbuilt values of white supremacism. I've always gravitated towards sort of public policy, and I've demurred from conversations around whiteness and racial politics. Not because I thought it was unimportant or uninteresting, but perhaps because, that opens up a certain vulnerability to you when you have just enough white privilege to be able to escape those conversations as a vitally important part of who you are. I was raised with a British name because of who my mother married. I went to British institutions. I was lucky enough to get into a grammar school. I was never raised in a major city with people of colour. So, my socialisation was very white, very British, and I also benefited from it, right? And if my name was Aaron, Bastani when I was younger, or Aaron, Ramadan or whatever, but a clearly non-white, non-European name, then it would have been very different. Or if I'd been raised in somewhere, say, parts of Lancashire or parts of London, with a bigger Iranian community, again, very different. But I just never related to it in that way. And then as you get older, and for what it's worth, my dad worked in the night economy, worked in, I think, the first kebab shop in Bournemouth.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't like he was a refugee at one point. So it wasn't like he was somebody who could also enjoy that privilege. It was, it's very strange when I look back at it now. And also my mother was probably racist when I think about it, because she didn't want me to, she was happy for me to speak foreign languages, but not Farsi, because it wasn't European. So she was kind of racist, I think. And she was obsessed with this film called Not Without My Daughter.
What was that?
It's like this film about basically this Iranian man who runs away with his daughter, and he takes her back to Iran, and this American woman's like, oh, my daughter's in Tehran. The whole film's like based in Tehran in the 1980s, and my mum sort of became obsessed with this idea. I come from quite a dysfunctional family, and my mum was kind of obsessed with the idea of my sort of father running away with me to Iran.
My mum used to live in Tehran.
Wow.
When she was a girl.
When? What age?
She must have been young, so I can't remember, but she speaks only like dirty, like street Farsi. She can cuss people out in Farsi, and like that's about it. But here's an interesting thing about your experience, and I think why sometimes the fragmentary or diverse nature of like kind of diaspora identities has not been fully grappled with in the kind of the fan renaissance that I'm talking about, is that the kinds of radical critical theory that I find that people are most drawn to at the moment is incredibly Manichaean and binary, right? And so this was always the critique of negritude from fellow decolonial thinkers, is that, well, maybe it kind of reproduces the binarism of white supremacy too much, and it doesn't look at how identity and power relations are shaped, in South-South relations. And so this is where thinkers like Edouard Glissant become really important. Incredible book, The Poetics of Relation. Really, really recommend it, because he starts talking about creolization, hybridity. I think it's antillanité. My French pronunciation is terrible.
Antillanité.
James isn't here to correct me. So looking at the specialness of the kind of Caribbean colonial experience, where you can have mixed heritage of Afro-Caribbean and Indian Trinidadian, where the coordinates are not solely shaped between whiteness and blackness,
right? Which is the European understanding of mixed heritage normally, right? It's one white parent, one Middle Eastern or Black or South Asian parent.
And despite the really lively kind of hybrid mixed communities in the United States of Afro-Hispanic, Afro-Cuban, etc., that's a kind of binary which is also very much reproduced in American notions of that, what constitutes the biracial. And so, I'm kind of aware that we're kind of running to a close. I think...
We don't need to rush it, Ash.
I know,
This is our show.
I know, I've just got so much to say on this.
This is our show. Well, you can do an FM about this anyway.
Is that, I've been thinking a lot about, where next for Afro-pessimism, where next for this kind of return to Fanon. I think where next for Afro-pessimism would be to look beyond American experiences of blackness. I think Afro-pessimism is the best history of America. I don't necessarily think it's the best history of global black identities. I think which
will increasingly decenter from the United States, right?
Yeah, but
Africa's population is set to double between now and 2050. The world's biggest cities are going to be in Africa by the end of this century. Luanda, Kinshasa,
but also,
not LA or New York.
Particularly Moten and Wilderson always neglected this. Winter. Sylvia Winter didn't so much in her work had the intimacies of 4 continents, I think it is. Really, really brilliant work. But one of the things that they neglected, for instance, was to look at the technologies of governance and racialization outside of plantations in the Deep South, and didn't look at Latin America, didn't look at the Caribbean even, which were the kind of dominant forms of slavery at the time. And they also dealt very badly with the plantation as it was found in the Eastern colonies, the Asian colonies.
Dutch colonies, right?
Yeah, so I would say that's one thing that that's where next for Afro-pessimism. And then the second thing would be for an analysis, looking at the negritude movement kind of beyond a kind of Manichaean ordering, maybe returning to the work of Glissant, hybridity. That's not to say egalitarianism. He's certainly looking and casting a sharp eye at power, but looking at he calls it relation at the periphery, so not just looking at things kind of going through the metropole, but looking at the peripheries of power, the kinds of relation going on there.
I mean, building on that hybridity idea, I mean, for me to even think of myself as half this or half that, my parents themselves are hybrids. So my dad's heritage really is Russian. Russian, Turkish, Jewish.
Is it?
Yeah, so even him, his if I go back to his family home, the language in the homestead is Turkish, Azeri Turkish. So if I say, I'm going to go to Iran and learn Iranian, my dad's language, I'd be learning Turkish if I was staying with his mother, God bless her soul, she's still alive. His brothers and sisters, they'll speak Turkish. And then the generation above them speaks Russian and Turkish. So it's a bit like, although they've obviously all passed away. I think I've got my two great uncles are buried in Moscow.
Oh, wow.
And then my great-granddad, who's buried in North Iran, refused to be buried in a country of infidels, a secular country, the USSR. So, yeah, and then you were saying about the whole diaspora thing. It made me think. And I wonder if, people should feedback about this, because I know you've got a very good friend who's also half Iranian. And is this unique to Iranians, or is this common? My dad, who was here as a political refugee, and his experience was obviously formative for him. He was a young person when he was here, and he was kind of left alone. He was a refugee. But he's always said, son, he goes, look, and I was like, the Iranian community, he goes, son, there's no Iranian community. We all fucking hate each other. They hate me, I hate them. Look, we leave the community to the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Italians, we all hate each other. That's it, okay? I have my friends, I don't care where the fuck they come from. And I'm thinking, is that specific to Iranians? Is that specific to him as a personality? Or, I'm like, Dad, you came to this country, there was a revolution where you were from, you lost everything. That was a trauma. And so to what extent does that trauma then constitute understandings of diaspora and belonging? These are big questions. And I guess we'll address them during the Novara FM.
Yes, we will. And just recommending someone's work who's very good at cultural memory, trauma, and experiences of migration. And India Ray Chowdhury, who I think is based at St Andrews, he taught me in my second year at uni. The only person of colour to have taught me at university, and he had the most incredible impacts on my thinking as both a literature student and also politically. And his work is all about legacies of trauma in the diaspora through migration. So I really recommend his work, and India Ray Chowdhury. You probably didn't hear it here first, but you heard it here second.
Well, we'll be back on Monday with The Fix. Tomorrow, we've got Novara FM. Check that out, 1 PM on Resonance 104.4 FM in London. Also on the Resonance website. And of course, for ease of access, the Novara Media website, novaramedia.com. That's at 1 PM, like I said, with Eleanor Penny, James Butler and Will Davies. And they'll be discussing the economic policy of John McDonnell and the emphasis on fiscal rather than monetary stimulus. Very, very complicated. I'm going to listen because I want to learn something. If you fancy that, get involved. Like I said, novaramedia.com.
I'm going to listen because Eleanor Penny has got one of the nicest of speaking voices I've heard in my life.
Eleanor's great.
Mellifluous.
We did a podcast with IPPR and Eleanor and I, and it was very good. So I'm looking forward to that tomorrow. So over and out. We'll see you next Monday. And yeah, tune in tomorrow, novaramedia.com, 1 PM.
Bye.